going to start by using a little bit of red in here. Now remember, my shaded side is going to be the darker side that I'm working with. I don't want to spread it too far. It's a heavy, strong color. I want to keep it where I already laid in my yellow. I don't want to go outside those lines. And if I find while I'm working my brush feels a little too big for the section that I'm working in, and I want something a little smaller, I can always swap out brushes, especially if you're trying to work those harder edges. And you want to make sure you've got enough paint in your brush that it's going to work those edges for you. Okay? If you have too much paint on your brush, you can always go back and then pull a little of it out when you're working on it. This also has some brown, so I'm going to pick that up at this time and add that in. It's not strictly a red color. Again, you want to keep referencing your photo that you're working from as you're going through. It's got a little bit of a reflection on that back edge, so I'm not going to mix the brown all the way back, but it does become a little bit deeper down here. And then I notice my stem is almost exclusively brown. I'll lay in a light layer for that. And I'm up in here, same on this side. And if you have a more porous canvas, so you can really see the canvas, you don't want to see it, just get your brush wet a little bit, a little damp, and you can go through and you can smooth things out. If you need to pick some up, get it a little bit more wet and clean, and pick it up with your brush and then you wipe it on your towel as you're working. Switch back over to some more of that red and work that in. If you want to keep it smoother, you want to give that feather light touch to things as you work the colors back and forth. You don't want to do it with a wet brush though. You need to make sure, see how it starts picking up if you're not careful. You don't want to be picking up the paint you put down. You want it to stay down. And this area on mine starts fading out a little bit more to that yellow again, so I am going to get it wet on purpose now and thin out my paint as I'm working. We're working with straight acrylic, so we're not doing any additives or gel mediums. We're just learning to control the paint as it is. If it gets a little too light, or redden it up a little bit, go through, add some more paint before you pick up more water to thin it back out. Now you have to be careful when you're thinning out with water, because sometimes it'll start showing more of your strokes in here. Whereas if you want it to be a little bit more smoother, you'd want to work more with solid colors when you're working with your paint to make sure that you're not getting too many gaps. For me, I like a little bit more of that rougher look when I'm working on things, so it doesn't bother me so much. I'm going to mix up a little bit of orange here, the areas where it gets a little brighter. And again, you can see when it's not thinned out, you get that smoother coverage of things. But I don't want to lose my center yellow completely, because mine does have a speckledy yellow area right here in the middle. So I'm going to add a little bit of white in there to keep that. See how over here it lifted off? Don't want that to happen. Go back in and throw a little bit more red in there. I'm going to pick up a little bit of white where my real high reflection areas are and go through and add that in. There's a few extra bumpy surfaces in here. And it is still wet, so I do have to go back and pick up a little bit more white if it picks up too much of the color in here. I always put that little layer of wax on the fruit. It gives it that extra little bit of shine. We're going to start with our darker colors and then work our way a little bit lighter. In this particular instance, the stem is coming out from the center right this way. It's been tilted and tipped a little bit. So I am going to add that in first. And since that fades out, as it kind of moves out and away in a starburst type pattern, add that in first. And the apple is not as smooth as the pear was, so it is going to have a little bit more stripiness to it. I'll work out some of those areas in the directions that they're going, pick up from the areas I don't want it to go. Again, I'm always referencing back to my photo while I'm working on this. You can add in a little water and then pick it back up. This is very similar to watercolor. When you're lifting it back off, you can lift off of your acrylic canvas as well. You just want to be careful you don't lift too much and make too much of a mess of things around it while you're working on it. I'm going to add in a little bit deeper brown down here where our cast shadows are before I work that up into the red. And I have to be intentional with my direction on this one, since it all is ultimately coming back up towards that center point. And that helps us to emphasize that it's round and that it's an apple when we work on that. I also have some cross colors going, some complementary colors in this, so I want to be really careful when I start working with those, that I'm not creating browns and muddy colors where I don't intend to. That can happen accidentally too. A little bit over here I'm going to add in, and just a smidge up on this top edge. And I'm adding that in there before I rinse my brush out and grab some water to work on blending that a little more. I'm also going to add, before I forget, a little bit more of that dark brown in there, right down in here where it is darker on this apple. So when I work on this blending, just want a little bit in there so I can fill in the gaps. And some of this little scumbling and scrubbing comes with practice. I'm going to lift a little bit out here. Got a little too much in. I want some out here, but not quite as much as I put in. I'm going to lift it up and put it on my rag or my towel. Don't want that blue showing though. That adds to the shadow a little bit underneath, but I don't want it in there quite as much as what it is. I'm going to add in a few more little highlight stripes in here, dragging it towards that center point, right? We don't want to lose that. Scratch this a little bit to lighten it and lift it. Get it reactivated just a smidge. Again, pulling that towards the center, because apples, when you start looking at them, do have some little stripes in there, don't they? And that's what we are emulating on here. Those little stripes that occur in apples. My apple has some more shading around this side towards that brown tone again. Not too much though, I don't want to overdo it. Just gonna add a little bit. Some of this is adding a little bit and then going back and adding a little bit more if you weren't happy with it the first time. There's a little bit of reflective shadow over here. It does go down into a cast shadow in that darker side, but it doesn't go completely dark. We can still see there's an edge there because of the way that that works. We're gonna work in there for where that reflection is again from the wax that they put on fruit. All fruit has wax. If you go to some of the natural stores, they leave it off. But if you have a regular grocery store, for the most part, if it's not organic, it has a waxy layer on it to protect it. And keep it a little fresher longer. Comes out to about here. Because of that foreshortening, it should look like it's getting a little smaller. Ooh, that's way too much water on there. Pick some of that back up and put that on my towel. And it's much darker down inside. I'm gonna add a little bit in there. And then my cast shadow's a little bit underneath on that. And I want to make sure we can tell that it goes down inside. So I'm going to make it a little bit darker and add just a touch of black down in here. Not very much. And there is a small cast shadow from this onto the apple. So I'm going to lay that in. And it fades out at the end, so I'm going to move that backwards just a little. And a little bit of yellow. You can always work backwards. Lighten it up. That's the key. I'm going to keep things pretty smooth. You don't want to overlift or overcomplicate while you're working. At some point in time, you always just want to say, all right, that's good enough. That's what we're going to have. That's what it is. And leave it at that. Always working the same direction. Right, out and away from that center. To give it that directional look. I think I'm going to leave it at that for this one. You can always go back in too for some of your underlying areas and your cast shadows if they weren't heavy enough for you. You can add a little bit more back in there to firm up that higher level of contrast between your fruit and the ground. I think I'm going to do a little bit more of an edge. Work that in with a little bit of a wet brush. There we go. Just to separate it from my table up here. Give it a little bit more green. Get that brush wet. Keep it a little bit more smooth on this top part. There you go. Okay, I'm gonna let that dry.